Hello, and yes, our main feature, starting in just a few seconds, is Mark Twain meets Dracula. Enter freely and of your own will. I'm Mark Dawidziak, and I bid you welcome. By way of introduction, I was drawn to this topic because it draws on two great areas of interest for me. You see, my books happen to include this, Mark My Words, Mark Twain on Writing, and this, The Bedside, Bathtub, and Armchair Companion to Dracula. But there's also this, Mark Twain's Guide to Diet, Exercise, Beauty, Fashion, Investment, Romance, Health, and Happiness. And yes, I know the title's too short. And this, The Night Stalker Companion, for those of you who remember that particular vampire story. But then there's also this, Mark Twain for Cat Lovers, and this, Bloodlines, Richard Matheson's Dracula, I Am Legend, and Other Vampires. What follows, therefore, is an expanded version of a paper given at the 8th International Conference on the State of Mark Twain Studies in August 2017. Now, during that conference, the collective knowledge about Mark Twain on this campus at that time was as staggering as it was awe-inspiring. The ground fairly shook from the combined weight of experience and expertise. Well, you were surrounded by Twainiacs who could tell you everything from his height and average weight to the recipe for his favorite cocktail. But how about Bram Stoker? If you are at all familiar with the name of that writer, it's probably because he wrote a little horror tome titled Dracula. Now, you may have heard of that, but Bram Stoker had 18 books published over a 35-year span. So here's my question. Name me another title. It's all right. I'll wait. Right. Unlike Mark Twain, Bram Stoker was a bit of a literary one-hit wonder. Now, yes, he did pen a couple of fairly impressive horror novels besides Dracula, including The Lair of the White Worm, which was turned into a bizarre 1988 film by director Ken Russell, as if Ken Russell was capable of directing any other kind of film. And The Jewel of the Seven Stars, considered one of the first major mummy novels. Now, there have been 4 film versions of that one, including a 1980 release, The Awakening, starring Charlton Heston. But let's face it, if we know the name Bram Stoker today, it's because he penned the landmark novel Dracula. He achieved a level of literary immortality by writing an incredibly influential, much adapted, much imitated novel about a potentially immortal creature. And yet, in his lifetime, Stoker wasn't even best known as a writer. So another question that may be on your finals. What was he best known for? He was best known as the manager of London's Lyceum Theatre. And the Lyceum Theatre was the home theatre of Sir Henry Irving. And when I ask my students at Kent State University if they recognize the name Sir Henry Irving, all I get is blank stares. Not one student in 10 years displays even a flicker of recognition. So how to describe Sir Henry Irving to them? And here's what I tell them. He was not only the leading Shakespearean actor of his day, he was the best known actor on the planet. You could take Tom Hanks, Denzel Washington, Harrison Ford, Will Smith, Chris Pratt, Chris Evans, Chris Hemsworth, and any other Chris's you might want to add, put them all together, multiply them by 10, and you still wouldn't have Sir Henry Irving. He was the first actor of any kind to be Sir anything. He was the first member of his profession to go down on a knee before a monarch, have a sword tapped on each shoulder. Arise, Sir Henry Irving. He was so big that when he died in October 1905, the funeral was at Westminster Abbey. That's the big room. That's where they bury the kings and queens. And yet, if you had attended that funeral in October 1905 and had the temerity to suggest that 115 years hence, to the month, a professor at a major American university would mention the name Sir Henry Irving, and not one student would recognize it, you would have been tossed out of that abbey for speaking heresy. But then, if you had had the temerity to suggest that his manager, Bram Stoker, would be better known, you wouldn't have been thrown out of that abbey. You would have been laughed out. Bram Stoker, his manager? And yet, Bram Stoker has emerged as the better known of the two because he wrote a book bigger than himself, Dracula. Now, what has that all got to do with the price of Twain? Well, we have reached that crossroads where Main Street Hannibal intersects with the Borgo Pass, and we get there by following another question. Does Mark Twain make something of a cameo appearance in Dracula, the landmark horror novel published in May 1897? Is he lurking in the shadows of that incredible 161,000-word book? Well, at the very least, best evidence suggests that the reports of his being mentioned in the novel are not greatly exaggerated. The moment occurs in chapter 14, when intrepid vampire fighter Professor Abraham Van Helsing is telling Jonathan Harker, Dr. John Seward, and their allies the facts of life and undeath. When they protest that vampires are beyond the scope of belief, he tells them, I heard once of an American who so defined faith, that faculty which enables us to believe things which we know to be untrue. For one, I follow that man. Mark Twain, most likely, is the American Van Helsing is citing here. Compare Van Helsing's paraphrase and the actual Twain line in Following the Equator. Faith is believing what you know ain't so. Knowing that Twain and Stoker were friends, most Dracula scholars have no doubt believing that the line is a sly nod to the author of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. But most works published on Dracula, as well as annotated editions of the novel, wrongly attribute the you know ain't so line to Pudd'nhead Wilson, which was published in 1894. Twain sent Stoker a copy of Pudd'nhead Wilson in 1894, and since the line is one of the chapter headings known as Pudd'nhead Wilson's Calendar, the assumption has been that Stoker knew it 3 years before Dracula was published. But back up the hearse a moment. The line actually appeared in Following the Equator as part of Pudd'nhead Wilson's new calendar, a device Twain carried over from the previous work. Following the Equator was published in 1897, the same year as Dracula. Now, does that drive a stake through the claim that Van Helsing was quoting Twain? Dracula scholar Leonard Wolfe has suggested another American as a possible source for the Van Helsing paraphrase, William James, the psychologist and philosopher who died the same year as Twain, 1910. Writing about the title essay in his The Will to Believe and other essays in popular philosophy, James observed that it is in justification of faith or defense of our right to adopt a believing attitude in religious matters, in spite of the fact that our merely logical intellect may not have been coerced. Well, James fails as the American claimant for 3 reasons. First, his scholarly phrasing has none of the folksy quality shared by the Van Helsing passage and the familiar Twain line. Second, there's no evidence that Stoker knew or read James, although Twain did, and was reading The Principles of Psychology in January of 1897. And third, The Will to Believe in Other Essays in Popular Philosophy also was published in 1897, raising the same question of access as Following the Equator. But Twain remains the favorite candidate for Van Helsing's Wise American, and despite their widespread error in dating Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar entry, students of Dracula probably arrived at the right conclusion. What Twain scholars could have told Stoker scholars was that Stoker did have access to Twain and Following the Equator in late 1896 and early 1897. Mark Twain, born Samuel Langhorne Clemens in 1835, was just one of the many literary celebrities Stoker counted among his friends. Stoker was admired and trusted by a staggering number of authors, artists, and statesmen on both sides of the Atlantic. Stoker carried on a long correspondence with, ready, Walt Whitman, and they met during one of the Lyceum's Theater's tour of America. Whitman said of the Irish writer, "My gracious, he knows enough for 4 or 5 ordinary men, and what tact! He's like a breath of good, healthy, breezy sea air." Friends with both Mark Twain and Walt Whitman? Well, that would be enough, certainly, but you're just beginning to chart the circumference of the Stoker friendship circle. In England, he was friends with both Sherlock Holmes creator Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde, once a suitor for the hand of Stoker's wife, Florence. Stoker remained close friends with W.S. Gilbert, the notoriously prickly playwright, best known for his operetta collaborations with Arthur Sullivan. And folks, nobody remained close friends with Gilbert. Stoker also counted Henry Dickens, the novelist's son, and Baroness Angela Burdett Coutts, a Dickens partner in philanthropic projects, among his many acquaintances. And journalist explorer Henry Morton Stanley, also friends with Twain, was one of the ones who encouraged Stoker to pursue literature as a career. Both painter James Whistler and aging poet Alfred Lord Tennyson sought Stoker's advice and valued his friendship. At the center of London's theatrical world, as the manager of superstar Irving's Lyceum Theatre, Stoker also was a dear friend to Britain's First Lady of the Stage, Ellen Terry. Through his post at the Lyceum, he got to know George Bernard Shaw, an Irishman like Stoker and Wilde, Sarah Bernhardt, and Edwin Booth. Among the leading political figures, he was admired by William Ewart Gladstone, Theodore Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. If you're judged by the company you keep, Stoker's marks are off the chart. Twain and Stoker may have met through Irving in England during the summer of 1879, when Twain also met Henry James, Charles Darwin, and James Whistler. Or they may have met in New York during the Lyceum Theater's 1883 tour of the United States. There would be many more meetings on both sides of the Atlantic. The two writers last saw each other in 1907, when Twain received his honorary degree from Oxford University. They corresponded until Twain's death in 1910. Twain invited both Irving and Stoker to invest in the Page Compositor, an ill-fated typesetting machine that played a key part in Twain's financial ruin. He returned Stoker's money when it was obvious that the typesetter was too complicated and accident-prone to succeed. "I can't get up enough courage to talk about the misfortune myself, except to you," Twain wrote to Stoker at the time. To repay his debts dollar for dollar, Twain embarked on a round-the-world lecture tour starting in Cleveland, Ohio, in July 1895. He continued his way west across North America, lecturing in Australia, India, and South Africa. He reached London 1 year later, and at this heroic moment of triumph, learned that his favorite daughter, Susie, had died of spinal meningitis at the family's home in Hartford, Connecticut. She was 24. Devastated, the Clemens family went into seclusion at a rented house in the Surrey town of Guildford. In October, they moved to a rented house at 23 Tedworth Square in London's Chelsea district. This was near Bram and Florence Stoker's St. Leonard's Terrace home in London. Many of Twain's closest English friends didn't even know he was in London. One of the few people the family saw on a regular basis during this difficult period was Bram Stoker, whose friendship, loyalty, and discretion were greatly valued by Twain. Stoker was admitted into the solitude, and he never betrayed that trust. He never wrote of what he observed inside 23 Tedworth Square. During that dark period, when Twain wasn't seeing much of anyone in England, he was seeing quite a bit of Bram Stoker. Quote, Twain liked discussing business matters with him, Michael Sheldon writes in his 2010 biography, Mark Twain, Man in White. His advice was uncommonly reliable. It was also fun to listen to his gossip. He knew all the famous people in the theatrical world and many of their secrets. Stoker secured theater tickets for Twain's daughters, Clara and Jean. He coaxed the Clemens family out to dinner in January 1897, and most significantly, Twain drafted Stoker to act as his agent for the British edition of his travel book about the round-the-world lecture tour following the equator. It was published by the London firm of Chatto and Windus in 1897. It was not the first time Twain had sought such representation from Stoker. Always trying and failing to write a successful play, Twain once asked him to be his agent in Britain for dramatic works. This did not prove to be a demanding assignment. Confidentially, I have always had the idea that I was well equipped to write plays, Twain said in 1895, but I have never encountered a manager who has agreed with me. During one of their meetings, the two men exchanged tales of witchcraft before a literary crowd at Brown's Hotel on Dover Street in London. Fine, tell us some more, Stoker said to Twain. I have a short story on witchcraft in hand. Now, some Twain scholars have suggested this short story grew into Dracula, but this conversation, recorded by American journalist Eugene Field, was in 1907, 10 years after Dracula was published. In a cozy corner by a fireplace, he spent a couple of hours enjoying a simple meal with his old friend, whose genial company he had enjoyed off and on for 20 years, Sheldon writes in Mark Twain, Man in White. Over meat pies and beer, Stoker could let down his guard and allow his Irish wit and charm to shine. The two writers shared an interest in dreams and ghost stories and spent their time together trading spooky tales of witchcraft like a couple of boys sitting around a campfire on a dark night. It was an ongoing discussion. During their first meetings, they exchanged views on the conflicts of duality, on nightmares, and on the unconscious, as Barbara Belford points out in her biography of Stoker, and their discussions of dreams and dual personalities continued. This was almost an obsession with Twain, who also carried on a warm correspondence with Robert Louis Stevenson, author of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Twain, who met Stevenson on a sunny April 1897 day in Washington Square Park, was more than taken with this horror tale than Stoker's novel, and Stevenson's story was on his mind during his final days at Stormfield in Redding, Connecticut. In late 1896, however, Twain certainly would have been well aware that his friend was about to publish a vampire novel. Stoker made sure to send Twain a presentation copy of Dracula, although there is no evidence that Twain read the supernatural story. Belford believes Twain read at least as far as the Van Helsing line, recognizing himself as the source for the rewritten maxim. David J. Scull, a leading authority on all things Dracula and Stoker, has examined all the evidence from all sides and recognizing that line for the sly nod that it is. Quote, Van Helsing is quoting Mark Twain, says Scal, author of the definitive Bram Stoker biography, Something in the Blood, published in 2016. There is no doubt in my mind that's Mark Twain putting in an appearance in Dracula. Related by Daniel Farzan in his 1975 biography of his great uncle, a Stoker family legend tells of Florence inviting the famous American author to tea. She gave the maid strict orders not to admit anyone but Mark Twain. When the time for Twain's arrival had slipped by, Florence sent for the maid. No word had been received of Mark Twain being delayed, the maid told her. I thought I heard the doorbell, Florence said. Yes, replied the maid. It was a Mr. Clemens, but I told him you weren't at home. Now, the story may be apocryphal. It was good enough to be repeated by generation after generation of Stokers. Twain may or may not have made it through the front door of the Stoker household on that occasion. But Bram Stoker certainly made sure he made it into Dracula, slipping him in through the side door.